The world does not reward the gentle. It consumes them.
So many.
For Eliza, a nurse at Pinewood General, this truth was written in the blue ink of final notices and the rhythmic wheeze of her daughter's struggling lungs. While the wealthy Blackwell family donated millions to the hospital's new wing for a tax break, Eliza was being threatened with a disciplinary write-up for excessive empathy, spending 10 minutes too long holding the hand of a dying man who had no one else. As she stood in the sterile hallway, exhausted and trembling, she realized the cruel irony. She spent her life healing a world that would happily watch her drown. Little did she know, the man she was about to save wasn't just a patient. He was the eye of a storm that would soon surround her home with 100 hungry shadows. The smell of antiseptic is a ghost that never quite leaves you. It clings to the fibers of your scrubs, nests in the pores of your skin, and follows you home like a persistent memory of pain. For Eliza, it was the scent of her survival. It was 3:15 a.m., the hour where the line between the living and the dead feels thinnest, when the heavy double doors of the emergency room burst open. There was no ambulance, no siren, just 3 men in suits that cost more than Eliza's annual salary, carrying a 4th man who looked like he had been shredded by a machine. "No questions," the tallest man barked, his voice like grinding stones. "The best trauma nurse you have. Now." Eliza stepped forward, not out of bravery, but out of a weary sense of duty. When they laid the man on the gurney, her breath caught. He was breathtakingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, sharp jawline, hair the color of midnight, and a physique that seemed too powerful for the hospital's flimsy linens. But it was his torso that stopped her heart. 3 deep, jagged gashes ran from his shoulder to his hip. They weren't surgical. They weren't from a car accident. They looked like the work of a beast. "I need a suture kit, lidocaine, and a 4-0 Vicryl," Eliza commanded, her professional instinct taking over. As she began to clean the wounds, something impossible happened. The blood, which should have been pouring out, was sluggish, thick, and darkened. When she wiped away the gore, she saw the edges of the skin already puckering, trying to knit themselves back together. Her hand trembled as she held the needle. She looked up, and for a split second, the man's eyes flickered open. They weren't brown or blue. They were a molten, predatory amber. "Gentle," he rasped. It wasn't a request. It was an observation. "You have gentle hands." He grabbed her wrist. His skin was fever-hot, radiating a pulse of energy that made the hair on Eliza's arm stand up. In that moment, the sterile ER vanished. She felt a strange, ancient pull, a recognition of something wild and untamed. Then, as quickly as he had woken, his eyes closed, and his grip went limp. "Finish it," the man in the suit ordered, his eyes darting to the door. "And forget you ever saw his face." Eliza did her job. She stitched the wounds with a precision that was more art than medicine. She didn't report the anomalies, the way the lidocaine seemed to have no effect, or how the wounds were half closed by the time she reached the final stitch. She was a woman who lived in the margins. She knew better than to invite trouble. By 7 a.m., the VIP patient was gone. The room had been scrubbed so clean, it was as if he had never existed. The only evidence left behind was a faint, earthy scent of pine and ozone lingering in the air, and a small, elegant envelope left on the nurse's station with Eliza's name on it. The drive home was a blur of gray October mist and the persistent rattle of her old sedan. Eliza's cottage sat on the edge of the shadow pines, a dense stretch of forest that the locals whispered was haunted. She had moved here after David left. David, who had claimed he wasn't cut out for fatherhood the moment Lucy was diagnosed with chronic asthma. She walked through the door, her knees nearly buckling with fatigue. "Mommy?" Lucy was sitting at the small kitchen table, her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who watched her for a few dollars and a hot meal, was just finishing a bowl of oatmeal. "Hey, my little warrior," Eliza whispered, kneeling to hug her daughter. Lucy's skin felt cool, but her breathing was slightly labored. The whistle that always signaled a bad night was coming. "The wind was loud last night," Lucy said, her eyes wide. "It sounded like someone was singing in the trees." "Just the pines, sweetie. They like to talk when it's cold," Eliza said, trying to sound convincing. After settling Mrs. Peterson and putting Lucy down for a nap, Eliza finally opened the envelope from the hospital. Inside was a check for $10,000 and a note on heavy vellum. "For your discretion, spend it on what matters." Eliza stared at the numbers until they blurred. $10,000. It was the roof repair. It was Lucy's specialist in the city. It was a year of breathing room. She should have felt relief, but instead, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Money like this didn't come from a place of kindness. It was a cage. It was payment for a secret she didn't even fully understand. She walked to the window and looked out at the shadow pines. The trees were swaying violently, though there was no breeze. That night, the air in the cottage grew heavy. Eliza sat by Lucy's bed, the girl's nebulizer humming a mechanical lullaby. Around midnight, the whistle in Lucy's chest grew louder. Eliza reached for the rescue inhaler, her heart hammering. Crunch. The sound came from the back porch. It wasn't the light footstep of a stray cat or the heavy thud of a deer. It was a deliberate, dragging sound. Eliza froze. She grabbed the only weapon she had, a heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet from the stove, and crept toward the kitchen. Her pulse was a drum in her ears. Scratch. Whine. It was a sound of absolute agony. Eliza peered through the small window in the back door. The porch light flickered, illuminating a scene that defied reality. Resting against her door was a wolf, but it was the size of a grizzly bear, its fur as black as a starless night, matted with fresh, steaming blood. She should have locked the door and called the police. She should have grabbed Lucy and run out the front. But then, the wolf looked up. Amber eyes. The same molten, intelligent amber she had seen in the ER. The wolf wasn't baring its teeth. It was pleading. It nudged the door with its snout, a low, pained rumble vibrating in its chest before its legs gave out. As Eliza watched, her hand trembling on the knob, the air around the wolf began to shimmer. A low, golden hum filled the kitchen, vibrating in Eliza's very bones. The massive animal began to shrink, its fur receding into pale skin, its paws lengthening into human hands. In less than a minute, the wolf was gone. In its place lay the man from the hospital, Alexander Blackwell, naked, bleeding, and unconscious on her porch. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza looked from the man to the check on the counter, then to the dark woods beyond. She realized then that the antiseptic smell she had tried to wash off was gone. The house now smelled of blood, pine, and the terrifying realization that her quiet life had just ended. She opened the door. "What have you done?" she whispered to the empty night. "What have you brought to my door?" The weight of a man is different when he is more than human. As Eliza hooked her arms under Alexander's shoulders to drag him across the threshold, she felt a density to his muscles that defied his lean frame. He felt like he was carved from the very oaks of the shadow pines, ancient, heavy, and pulsing with a heat that scorched through her scrubs. She managed to get him onto the kitchen floor, the linoleum cold against his bloodied skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every nurse's instinct screamed at her to call 911, but every mother's instinct told her that doing so would bring a different kind of death to her doorstep. The men in suits, the check for $10,000, the molten amber eyes. This wasn't a medical emergency. It was a war. She moved with the mechanical grace of a veteran trauma nurse. She grabbed her medical bag, the one she kept stocked with liberated supplies for Lucy's emergencies, and a stack of clean towels. "Stay with me, Alexander," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. The wound in his side was fresh. It wasn't the jagged claw marks from the hospital. It was a clean, high-velocity entry wound, a silver-tipped bullet, though she didn't know that yet. She only knew that the flesh around the hole was blackened and angry, as if it were being burned from the inside out. As she began to debride the wound, Alexander's hand shot out, pinning her wrist to the floor. His eyes snapped open. The amber was gone, replaced by a terrifying, lightless black. "Don't," he hissed, his voice a guttural snarl that rattled the plates in the cupboard. "I'm a nurse, Alexander. If I don't get the necrotic tissue out, you'll go septic," Eliza said, her voice trembling but firm. She didn't pull away. She looked him directly in those black pits of eyes. "You came to my house. You chose me. Now let me do my job." The tension in his arms snapped. The black in his eyes receded, leaving the amber behind, weary and shimmering with pain. He let out a breath that sounded like a wounded animal's whimper. "The bullet. It's coded. You have to find the fragments." For the next hour, the kitchen became an altar of survival. Under the flicker of a yellowing fluorescent bulb, Eliza worked. She used a pair of sterilized tweezers to pull 3 jagged shards of a strange, shimmering metal from his side. With each piece she removed, his body shuddered, and a faint, golden steam rose from the wound. By the time she was finished, she was covered in his blood, and he was wrapped in her favorite knitted throw, propped against the base of the dishwasher. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cracking as the adrenaline began to fade. Alexander looked at her, his gaze lingering on the stethoscope draped around her neck. "I'm Alexander Blackwell. To your world, I am a billionaire recluse. To mine, I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Eliza let out a dry, hysterical laugh. "Alpha King? Like a werewolf?" "Shifter," he corrected gently. "The stories your people tell are shadows of the truth. We are the guardians of the wild places. But my kind is not a monolith. There are those who believe we should rule the humans, not hide from them. The Southern Pack, they want my throne, and they want the war that comes with it. And the hospital? Those wounds? An ambush," he said, his jaw tightening. "They thought I was weak. They didn't expect me to find a healer who didn't flinch at the sight of a monster." "I'm not a healer," Eliza whispered, looking at her blood-stained hands. "I'm just a nurse who's behind on her mortgage." "You are more than you know, Eliza," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. A soft floorboard creaked behind them. Eliza whirled around. Lucy was standing in the doorway, her rabbit clutched to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The blood on the floor, the strange man in the blanket, and her mother's terrified face. "Mommy?" Lucy whispered. "Is the wolf man okay?" Eliza froze, her heart stopping. She expected Lucy to scream, to run, to have an asthma attack triggered by the terror, but Lucy didn't move. She walked slowly toward Alexander, her small bare feet silent on the linoleum. "Lucy, stay back," Eliza warned. But Alexander held out a hand, palm up, a gesture of absolute submission. "It's all right, little warrior," he said, his voice miraculously soft. "The wolf is resting now." Lucy stopped in front of him. She reached out and touched the bandage on his side with a finger, as light as a butterfly's wing. "You have a boo-boo," she said solemnly. "Mommy is the best at fixing boo-boos. She has magic hands." Alexander looked up at Eliza, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. something that looked like hope, or perhaps a crushing weight of responsibility. "Yes," he murmured. "I think she does." The moment was shattered by a sound from outside. It wasn't a howl, not yet. It was the sound of 100 heavy bodies moving through the undergrowth of the shadow pines. It was the sound of a closing trap. Alexander's expression hardened instantly. He closed his eyes for a second, his nostrils flaring. "They're here," he whispered. "The Southerners?" Eliza asked, her hand flying to Lucy's shoulder. "No," Alexander said, his eyes snapping open, glowing with a fierce, regal light. "The Southerners are the hunters, but my pack, they have followed my scent. They have come to see if their king is dead or alive." He struggled to stand, the blanket falling away to reveal the bandages Eliza had just applied. He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. Eliza joined him, clutching Lucy to her side. Outside, the mist had thickened, turning the world into a haunting landscape of silver and gray. And there, standing at the edge of her small yard, were the wolves. They weren't hidden. They were standing in a perfect, terrifying semicircle. Some were as large as the black wolf she had seen. Others were smaller, leaner. There were dozens of them, maybe 100, their eyes glowing like tiny lanterns in the dark. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. "They won't harm you," Alexander said, though his voice was tight. "But the Southern Alpha, he will not let this insult stand. He knows I am here. He knows I am wounded. And he knows a human has seen what should have remained hidden." He turned to Eliza, his amber eyes burning with a sudden, desperate intensity. "Eliza, you saved my life tonight. But in doing so, you have inadvertently stepped onto a battlefield. By morning, my enemies will know your name. They will know about the girl with the warrior's heart." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "I have a choice to make. I can leave now and draw them away, but they will eventually return for the witness. Or you can come with me, to the north, to the only place where I can guarantee that no one will ever touch you again." Eliza looked at Lucy, whose breathing was beginning to hitch, the stress finally catching up to her lungs. She looked at the bills on the counter. She looked at the 100 wolves standing guard in her yard. Her life was gone. The nurse, the single mom, the woman who lived in the margins. She had died the moment she pulled those silver shards from a king's side. "We can't stay," Eliza whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "No," Alexander said, "but we have to survive the night first." Suddenly, a high, piercing howl ripped through the air, not from the wolves in the yard, but from deep within the forest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. The wolves in the yard responded with a collective, low-frequency growl that shook the cottage to its foundations. "They're attacking," Alexander said, his hand reaching for the cast-iron skillet Eliza had dropped. A grim, predatory smile touched his lips. "It seems my enemies have forgotten that a wounded king is still a king." The sound of a home being violated is one a mother never forgets. It began not with a howl, but with the sickening crunch of the back porch wood splintering under a weight far too heavy for any man. "Get in the corner. Under the table, Lucy. Now!" Eliza's voice wasn't a scream. It was a command, forged in the high-pressure furnace of the ER. She shoved her daughter into the small gap between the refrigerator and the heavy oak table, shielding her with her own body. Alexander stood in the center of the kitchen, his posture a jagged line of agony and defiance. The golden shimmer began to ripple over his skin again, the agonizing process of a forced shift. He wasn't fully healed, and the effort turned his veins into cords of glowing amber. "Don't shift," Eliza pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Your sutures will rip. You'll bleed out before you can finish the fight." "I will not let them touch you," he growled, his voice vibrating between human speech and a guttural roar. The kitchen window exploded. A lean gray wolf, its fur matted with the filth of the lowlands, burst through the glass in a spray of glittering shards. It landed on the linoleum with a heavy thud, its claws skidding before it found purchase. This wasn't one of the majestic guardians from the yard. This was an assassin, a scavenger of the southern pack, eyes milky with a rabid, unnatural hunger. Alexander lunged, but his wounded side betrayed him. As he moved, the fresh bandages blossomed crimson, and he stumbled, a low groan escaping his lips. The gray wolf saw the opening. It coiled its haunches, baring yellowed fangs as it prepared to spring at the wounded king's throat. Time slowed for Eliza. She looked at the blood on her floor, the glass in her daughter's hair, and the man who had brought a check for $10,000 just to keep her safe. The fear that had paralyzed her for years, fear of debt, fear of David's shadow, fear of the unknown, was suddenly replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. She didn't reach for a knife. She reached for the cast-iron skillet, the heavy, seasoned weight of her daily life. As the gray wolf leaped, Eliza stepped into its path. With a scream that was less a cry of terror and more a war cry of a mother pushed to the edge, she swung. The heavy iron connected with the wolf's skull with a sickening metallic crack. The creature was midair, its momentum carrying it into the blow. The impact sent it spinning sideways, its head snapping back as it crashed into the kitchen counter, sliding to the floor in a heap of limp fur and broken pottery. It didn't get back up. The silence that followed was broken only by Eliza's ragged breathing and the clatter of the skillet as it hit the floor. Her hands were vibrating so hard she couldn't close her fingers. Alexander stared at her. The amber light in his eyes softened into a look of profound, almost reverent shock. He looked at the fallen wolf, then back at the nurse in the blood-stained scrubs. You struck a shifter," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "With a cooking tool." It's a very good skillet," Eliza gasped, her knees finally giving way. "Mommy?" Lucy's small voice came from under the table. "Did you win?" "Yes, baby," Eliza said, crawling toward her. "Mommy won." But the victory was short-lived. Outside, the low growls of the northern pack had turned into a cacophony of snarls and tearing flesh. The southern pack had breached the perimeter. The shadow pines were no longer a border. They were a slaughterhouse. "We have to go," Alexander said, his face turning ghostly pale as his own blood loss caught up to him. He grabbed Eliza's hand, pulling her up. "More will follow the scent of the kill. My pack is holding the line, but they are outnumbered. They came for me, but they will stay for the healer who defies them." "Where?" Eliza asked, grabbing Lucy and her medical bag. "The car?" "No, they'll expect the roads. Follow me." He led them toward the pantry, a small, cramped space smelling of dried pasta and Lucy's fruit snacks. He kicked aside a heavy sack of flour and knelt, fumbling with a recessed ring in the floorboards that Eliza had lived over for 3 years and never noticed. With a grunt of pain that made Eliza's heart ache, he heaved. A heavy trapdoor groaned open, revealing a set of steep, stone-hewn stairs descending into a cool, damp darkness. "A root cellar?" Eliza asked, staring into the abyss. "A moonshine tunnel from the Prohibition era," Alexander corrected, his eyes flashing toward the kitchen door as something began to scratch at the wood. "I own this land, Eliza. All of it. I bought this cottage decades ago because of what lies beneath it. It leads to the Blackwell estate, 2 miles to the east. You're my landlord?" The absurdity of the revelation almost made her laugh, even as the kitchen door began to buckle under the weight of the monsters outside. "I'm your protector," he said firmly. "Now get in. I'll close the door behind us." Eliza didn't hesitate. She lifted Lucy into her arms and stepped into the dark. The air smelled of wet earth and ancient secrets. As Alexander lowered the trapdoor, the last thing Eliza saw was the flickering kitchen light, illuminating the black wolf tracks on her floor. Then, there was only the dark, the sound of Alexander's labored breathing, and the distant, muffled echoes of 100 wolves surrounding a house that was no longer a home. They moved through the tunnel in a rhythmic, agonizing crawl. Alexander led the way, his hand trailing on the damp stone wall for support. Eliza followed close behind, holding Lucy so tight the little girl could feel her mother's heart hammering like a trapped bird. "Is it a secret passage?" Lucy whispered, her curiosity finally outweighing her fear. "Like in the storybooks?" "Exactly like that, brave one." Alexander's voice came from the gloom, strained but steady. "And at the end of every secret passage, there is a sanctuary." After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to slope upward. The air changed, losing its earthen weight and becoming crisp, with the scent of pine and something expensive, lavender and polished wood. Alexander pushed against a wooden ceiling, and a square of moonlight flooded the tunnel. They emerged into the center of a grand, circular room. Books, thousands of them, lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, and the floor was covered in a rug so soft it felt like walking on a cloud. This wasn't a cottage. It was a fortress of knowledge and power. Alexander collapsed into a leather armchair, his face the color of ash. The journey through the tunnel had cost him the last of his strength. "We are safe here," he gasped, his eyes fluttering. "For tonight." Eliza immediately went to him, her nurse's mind overriding her awe. She began to check his pulse, her fingers pressing against the hot skin of his neck. "You're in shock, Alexander. I need more than just my back. I need real equipment." "Marcus," Alexander managed to say, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors. As if on cue, the doors swung open. A tall man in a sharp, gray suit stepped in. He looked like a corporate lawyer, but the way he moved, with the silent, fluid grace of a predator, told Eliza everything she needed to know. "My king," Marcus said, bowing his head. His eyes darted to Eliza and Lucy, flickering with a mixture of suspicion and profound respect. "The perimeter of the estate is secured. The Southern Alpha has withdrawn, but he left a message." Alexander's eyes snapped open. "What message?" Marcus hesitated, looking at Eliza. "He knows about the human. He calls her the healer of the North. He says that by saving you, she has challenged the old laws. He won't stop until she is extinguished." Alexander's hand found Eliza's. His grip was weak, but his gaze was iron. "She is not just a human," Alexander said, his voice echoing in the vast library. "She is the woman from the scrolls, the one with the healing hands and the heart of a lion." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp tunnel. "What scrolls, Alexander? What are you talking about?" He looked at her, and for the first time, Eliza saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than the wolves. It was destiny. "There is a prophecy, Eliza," he whispered, "a story as old as the pines themselves. It says that when the North is at its weakest, a mate will appear from the world of men. She will not be a wolf, but she will carry the power to mend what is broken. She will be the bridge between our worlds." He looked at her hands, the hands that had stitched him, the hands that had swung the iron skillet. "You are the mate of the Alpha King, and that makes you the most important and most hunted woman in this world." Eliza looked at Lucy, who was already falling asleep on the plush rug, and then back at the man who had just changed the meaning of her entire existence. "I just wanted to pay my bills, Alexander," she said softly, a single tear tracking through the blood on her cheek. "I know," he replied, his thumb brushing her skin. "But the universe has a different plan for you." Morning at the Blackwell estate did not arrive with the cheerful chirp of birds. It arrived with the silent, disciplined movement of sentries. When Eliza woke on the velvet chaise longue in the library, the sun was bleeding through the high lancet windows, casting long, crimson shadows across the thousands of leather-bound books. Lucy was still asleep, tucked under a heavy cashmere throw on the sofa, her breathing deep and miraculously clear. The air in this house was different. It felt filtered, charged with an energy that seemed to soothe the inflammation in her daughter's lungs. "She is safe here, Eliza. The stone of this house was quarried from the heart of the northern range. It holds the pack's strength." Eliza turned to see a woman standing by the fireplace. She looked strikingly like Alexander, the same high cheekbones and regal bearing, but her eyes were a soft, mossy green instead of amber. She wore a simple white sweater and dark trousers, yet she carried herself like a general. "I'm Elena," she said, stepping forward with a glass of fresh orange juice. "Alexander's sister, and according to the whispers currently racing through our hallways, the woman who saved the king with a piece of kitchenware." Eliza took the juice, her hand still feeling the ghost weight of the iron skillet. "I didn't have much of a choice." "Choice is a luxury few of us have lately," Elena said, her expression softening. "Let's get you and the little one cleaned up. My brother is in the solarium. He is stubborn. He refused the sedative Marcus tried to give him. He's waiting for you." After a hot shower and a change into clothes that Ilna provided, soft, expensive fabrics that made Eliza feel like an imposter, she led Lucy toward the glass-walled solarium at the back of the manor. Alexander was sitting up, draped in a dark robe. He looked better. The miraculous healing of his kind, already knitting the skin over the bullet wound. But the lines of exhaustion around his eyes remained. He was staring out at the vast, rolling grounds of the estate. Beyond the manicured gardens lay a dark, impenetrable tree line. And there, standing like statues among the pines, were the wolves. Dozens of them. Some were white as bone, others charcoal gray, all of them facing outward, guarding the heart of their kingdom. "This is the underworld, Eliza," Alexander said without turning around. "Not a place of fire and brimstone, but a world that breathes beneath the skin of yours." "How many?" Eliza asked, sitting in the chair opposite him while Lucy ran to a large chest of wooden toys in the corner. "Thousands," he replied. "In North America alone, we are divided into 4 great territories. The North is the largest, but the South is the hungriest. My father ruled with an iron fist for 60 years. He kept the peace through fear. When I took the throne, I wanted something different. I wanted integration. I wanted our children to go to your schools, our sick to use your hospitals. I wanted the hiding to end. That's why you were at Pinewood General," Eliza realized. "I was meeting with the hospital board, disguised, of course, to discuss a partnership. The Southern Alpha, a man named Silas, saw it as a betrayal of our blood. He believes humans are cattle, or at best, a resource to be exploited. To him, my desire for peace is a sign of human weakness." Alexander looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the morning light. "The ambush at the hospital was meant to start a coup. If the king dies while trying to befriend humans, the traditionalists will flock to Silas. But I didn't die. I found a nurse who saw the man behind the monster. And now? Now, the war is no longer in the shadows," Alexander said. "Silas has declared me tainted. He claims that by allowing a human to heal me, I have broken the ancient covenant. He is gathering the dissident packs. He told Marcus that if I do not hand you over to be judged by the High Council, he will burn the northern forests to the ground. Eliza felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her chest. Judged? What does that mean? It means execution, Eliza, Elena said from the doorway, her voice sharp with anger. They fear you, not because you're a threat, but because you are a symbol. If a human can heal an alpha, then the alpha doesn't need the pack's mystic purity to survive. You represent a world where we aren't alone, and to Silas, that is the end of his power. Alexander stood up, moving with a slight wince to the glass wall. He pressed his hand against the pane. Outside, a massive white wolf broke from the tree line and trotted toward the house, stopping just below the window to bow its head. That is my beta, Marcus, Alexander explained, and those surrounding the house are the first circle. They would die for me. But more importantly, they would die for the mate of the king. Stop calling me that, Eliza whispered, standing up. I'm a mother. I'm a nurse. I have a life that involves grocery lists and shifts at the hospital. I am not a character in a prophecy. Eliza, Alexander turned, his voice low and magnetic. When I was on your porch, dying from a silver-laced bullet, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you run? I don't know, she snapped, her eyes stinging. I do, he said, stepping into her space. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, that same primal pull she'd felt in the ER. You felt it, the tether. It's not a fairy tale, and it's not a choice. It's a biological imperative. Your soul recognized mine. My wolves feel it too. That's why they didn't tear your house down to get to me. They recognized the scent of the one meant to hold the king's heart. Lucy let out a small, happy giggle as she found a wooden wolf figurine in the toy chest. The innocence of the sound contrasted sharply with the talk of war and executions. Eliza looked at her daughter, then back at the 100 wolves guarding the perimeter. She realized then that Alexander was right about one thing. The hiding was over. She couldn't go back to the cottage. She couldn't go back to the hospital. She was in the heart of the den now. What happens next? She asked, her voice steadying. We prepare, Alexander said. Silas will not wait for a formal challenge. He will strike when he thinks we are distracted by your presence. He wants to prove that I am too soft to protect my own. We need to show him that the North has never been stronger. Suddenly, the white wolf outside, Marcus, let out a short, sharp bark. He looked toward the northern gates. Alexander's expression shifted instantly from a man in love to a king at war. He grabbed a radio from the side table. Report. Marcus's voice came through, distorted, but urgent. My king, a messenger from the south has arrived at the gate. He isn't alone. He's brought a gift for the healer. Alexander's jaw tightened. Bring them to the courtyard. Elena, take Lucy to the inner sanctum. Eliza, stay behind me. They moved to the grand stone courtyard. The air was biting now, smelling of salt and wet fur. A group of 5 shifters in ragged leather clothes stood by the fountain. They looked wilder, more animalistic than Alexander's people. At their feet sat a large wooden crate, perforated with air holes. The lead messenger, a man with a scarred face and eyes full of malice, sneered at Alexander. The Southern Alpha sends his regards to the human queen. He heard the little pup has trouble breathing. He thought she might like a pet to keep her company in her final days. He kicked the crate. A low, mournful whimper came from inside. Open it, Alexander commanded. Marcus pried the lid off with a crowbar. Inside was not a pet. It was a wolf pup, no older than Lucy, its fur a sickly, matted gray. It was shivering violently, its ribs sticking out, and its breathing was a series of wet, agonizing gasps. Eliza's nurse's heart shattered. She pushed past Alexander before he could stop her. Eliza, no! She didn't listen. She knelt by the crate. The pup's eyes were cloudy, filled with a terrifyingly familiar struggle. "It's an asthma attack," Eliza whispered, touching the pup's neck. "No, it's worse. They've poisoned him with something to mimic her condition." The messenger laughed. "A message, healer. Everything you love will wither like this cur. If you can heal the king, let's see you heal a dying cub." Eliza looked at the dying pup, then up at the sneering messenger. For the first time, she saw the true face of the underworld, not the regal strength of Alexander, but the senseless cruelty of Silas. She stood up, her eyes flashing with a fire that made the messenger flinch. "I don't need magic to heal him," Eliza said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I just need you to get out of my way." She turned to Alexander, her face set in grim determination. "I need my bag, and I need a nebulizer. Now." Alexander looked at her, and in that moment, the prophecy was no longer a story. It was a living, breathing reality. He turned to his men, his voice a roar. "You heard her. Bring the healer whatever she requires. And Marcus, take the messengers to the dungeons. If the cub dies, they don't leave this estate alive." As Eliza knelt back down to save the small, shivering life in the crate, she realized she wasn't just a guest anymore. She was the one holding the line between life and death. The medical wing of the Blackwell estate was a marvel of hidden technology. But as Eliza knelt on the cold tile floor, she didn't care about the state-of-the-art monitors. She only cared about the small, fluttering heartbeat beneath her palm. "Oxygen! Now!" she shouted. Elena was there, moving with surprising efficiency for someone who had likely never stepped foot in a human nursing school. She handed Eliza a pediatric oxygen mask. The pup was too small for it, the plastic covering its entire snout. But as the concentrated air began to flow, the violent racking of its chest slowed, just a fraction. "It's not just poison," Eliza muttered, her fingers dancing over the pup's matted fur. "It's a heavy metal toxin. It's paralyzing the diaphragm." She reached into her bag, pulling out a vial of a specialized bronchodilator she kept for Lucy's worst nights. It was a risk. Shifter physiology was faster, more volatile. But she had no other choice. She administered the injection into the pup's haunch. Alexander stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the light from the hall. He watched her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Behind him, the warriors of the First Circle stood in silent vigil, their eyes glowing in the dim medical light. They weren't watching their king, they were watching the human woman. Minutes ticked by like hours. The only sound was the hiss of the oxygen and the frantic beating of Eliza's own heart. Then, the shimmer began. The gray fur receded, the snout shortened, and the small, twisted limbs lengthened. In the blink of an eye, the pup was gone. In its place lay a small boy, no older than 6, with hair the color of river silt, and skin so pale it was almost translucent. He gasped, a clear, deep breath, and his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, innocent blue. A collective intake of breath echoed through the room. Marcus, the stern beta who had treated Eliza with nothing but cold suspicion, took a step forward, his hand trembling as it hovered over his chest. That is the son of the Western Vanguard," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "He was taken in a raid 3 weeks ago. We thought him dead." The boy looked at Eliza, his small hand reaching out to catch the edge of her scrubs. It doesn't hurt to breathe anymore," he rasped. Eliza felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She squeezed the boy's hand. "No, sweetheart. It's okay now. You're safe." Alexander walked into the room. He didn't look at the boy first. He looked at Eliza. He knelt beside her, his hand covering hers on the boy's shoulder. "You didn't just save a shifter, Eliza," Alexander said, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and something that sounded like prayer. You saved a future. You showed my people that a human's touch can be a greater force than an alpha's bite." He turned to the warriors in the room. His voice dropped to a low, commanding rumble. "Look at this child. Silas sent him here to die as a mockery. He wanted to use our biology against us. But the healer did not see a cur or an enemy. She saw a life. From this moment on, anyone who questions her place in this pack questions me." One by one, the warriors dropped to a knee. Marcus was the last, his head bowed low. "Forgive my doubt, healer. The North is in your debt." But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A low, vibrating hum began to echo through the floorboards, the sound of the estate's heavy iron gates being struck by a force like a battering ram. Alexander stood, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "Elena, take the boy to Lucy. Keep them in the sub-basement. Marcus, to the walls." Eliza followed Alexander to the balcony overlooking the main courtyard. The sun was beginning to set, staining the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange. At the edge of the Blackwell grounds, the forest was moving. It wasn't just a few scouts. Emerging from the shadow pines were scores of wolves, lean, hungry, and marked with the jagged white stripe of the southern pack. They didn't howl. They moved with a terrifying, silent discipline. 100, Marcus reported, his eyes fixed on the tree line. A full century of Silas's elite. And there, in the center, a massive silver wolf stepped into the clearing. It was nearly the size of Alexander. But where Alexander was regal and composed, this creature was a nightmare of scarred flesh and bared teeth. It let out a sound that wasn't a howl, but a distorted, human-like scream of rage. "Alexander!" The wolf's voice echoed in the minds of everyone present, a telepathic burst of pure malice. "Hand over the sacrilege. Hand over the human who dares to stitch the skin of a god. Hand her over, and I will leave your pups alive." Alexander stepped to the edge of the balcony. The golden light began to radiate from him, more powerful than Eliza had ever seen it. He didn't shift, not yet, but his presence seemed to double in size. "Silas!" Alexander roared, his voice carrying across the valley like thunder. "You come to my home with a gift of poison and a threat of fire. You speak of gods, but you act like a scavenger. This woman is not a sacrilege. She is my mate. She is the heart of the North, and if you want her, you will have to tear her from my cold, dead hands." The silver wolf let out a bone-chilling snarl. "So be it. Tonight, the North falls." With a single unified roar, the 100 southern wolves lunged toward the gates. "Eliza, get inside!" Alexander commanded, turning to her. "No!" she shouted, grabbing his arm. "You're still not fully healed, Alexander. That bullet wound, if you shift fully and engage him, the internal pressure will tear the sutures. You'll bleed out in minutes." "It doesn't matter," he said, his eyes glowing amber. "I have to protect my people. I have to protect you." "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "You're a king. Don't fight him on his terms. Fight him on yours." Alexander paused, his hand on the stone railing. He looked at the chaos below, the clash of black and gray fur, the sound of tearing metal and bone. He looked at Eliza, the woman who had brought science and soul into his world of blood and teeth. "His terms are violence," Alexander whispered. My terms are you." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the courtyard. The main gates had given way. The southern wolves flooded in like a gray tide. Alexander grabbed Eliza, his grip firm but gentle. "Stay in the library. If the line breaks, Marcus has orders to take you through the tunnels. Don't look back, Eliza. Promise me." "Alexander, promise me." "I promise," she whispered, her heart breaking. He leaned down and kissed her, a hard, desperate taste of ash and hope. Then he stepped off the balcony, He didn't fall. He shifted mid-air, a mountain of black fur and muscle erupting from the human form. He hit the ground with the force of a meteor, his roar drowning out the sounds of the battle as he charged directly toward the silver wolf. Eliza stood on the balcony, frozen, as she watched the 100 wolves surround the house, and the man she was beginning to love threw himself into the center of the storm. The library was a fortress of silence, but it could not drown out the primal symphony of the courtyard. Eliza stood behind the reinforced glass, her fingers leaving foggy prints on the pane. Below, the world was a blur of silver, gray, and black. It was a dance of teeth and fur, a struggle for the very soul of the shadow pines. In the center of the carnage, the two alphas were locked in a stalemate of titans. Alexander, the massive black wolf, was a shadow of regal fury. But Silas, the silver-furred nightmare of the South, was larger, fueled by a mad, zealot's hunger for dominance. Every time Alexander lunged, Eliza saw the flash of white bandages beneath his black fur. They were already turning a sickening, heavy crimson. "He's tearing himself apart," Eliza whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered what she had told him. The internal pressure will tear the sutures. By shifting, by fighting, Alexander was essentially choosing to bleed out for the sake of his people. He wasn't just fighting Silas, he was fighting his own mortality. Silas saw the weakness. The silver wolf feinted a strike at Alexander's throat, then dived low, his massive jaws snapping shut on Alexander's injured flank. A howl of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through the night. Alexander collapsed to one knee, his black fur matted with a sudden torrential flow of blood. The northern wolves wavered. Their king was down. In the shifter world, the alpha was the sun. If the sun went out, the pack was lost to the cold. Silas stood over Alexander, his silver fur stained red, his eyes glowing with a triumphant, sickly light. He began to shift back, his human form emerging with a series of wet, popping sounds. A tall, skeletal man with a face like a hatchet. "Look at your king," Silas's voice echoed. Human now, but still carrying that terrifying telepathic weight. "He bleeds like a dog. He chose a human over his own blood. And now he dies in the dirt." Eliza couldn't watch anymore. She didn't look for Marcus. She didn't look for the hidden tunnels. She turned and ran. She ran through the opulent hallways of the Blackwell estate, her feet thudding on the priceless rugs. She burst into the medical wing and grabbed two things: a heavy-duty trauma kit and the portable nebulizer she had used on the pup. "Eliza, stay back!" Elena shouted, appearing from the shadows of the nursery, holding Lucy tight. "He's dying, Elena!" Eliza shouted back, her voice cracking. "And if he dies, we all do. I'm not a mate who waits in a tower. I'm a nurse." She didn't wait for a response. She threw open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the night air. The smell hit her first, the copper tang of blood and the musk of 100 terrified animals. The wolves of the southern pack snarled at her, their hackles raised, but they didn't attack. There was something about her, perhaps the scent of Alexander's mark, or perhaps the sheer, insane courage of a lone human walking into a wolf war, that gave them pause. She marched into the center of the courtyard. Silas turned, his skeletal face twisting into a sneer. He was holding a jagged silver blade, hovering it over the neck of the black wolf, who lay panting in the dust. "The sacrilege herself," Silas hissed. "You come to watch him die, or do you come to beg for your life?" Eliza didn't look at Silas. She looked at the black wolf. Alexander's amber eyes were unfocused, his breathing a series of wet, shallow rattles. He was slipping away. "Get away from him," Eliza said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden silence of the courtyard, it carried like a gunshot. Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "And what will you do, human? Hit me with a skillet?" I am the alpha of the South. I am the purity of the blood. You're a coward, Eliza said, stepping closer, her trauma kit clutched to her chest. You attacked him when he was wounded. You poisoned a child. You talk about purity. But you're just a man who's afraid of change. Silas snarled, his eyes turning back to that rabid silver. He raised the blade. I will take your head and mount it on the gates of the North. Then do it, Eliza challenged, her chin up, her heart screaming with terror she refused to show. But while you're busy killing me, look around you, Silas. The northern wolves had stopped fighting. They were moving, forming a tight, protective circle around Eliza and their fallen king. Even the southern wolves were hesitating, watching this tiny woman stand between two monsters. They aren't fighting for a king anymore, Eliza said, her voice growing stronger. They're fighting for a world where their children don't have to be poisoned to prove a point. They're fighting for life. Alexander let out a low, vibrating growl. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was a sound of awakening. Eliza knelt beside him, ignoring Silas entirely. She ripped open the trauma kit. Alexander, look at me. Stay with me. I need you to shift back. You're losing too much blood in this form. Shift back, and I can save you. He is mine, Silas roared, lunging forward. But Marcus was there. The white wolf intercepted Silas midair, a blur of bone-crushing force. Not tonight, scavenger! The courtyard erupted back into chaos, but this time, the momentum had shifted. Inspired by the human woman's defiance, the northern pack fought with a ferocity that bordered on the divine. Eliza worked in the eye of the storm. She didn't have the luxury of a sterile field. She used her bare hands to pack the gaping wound in Alexander's side with hemostatic gauze. Shift, Alexander! Please! The golden shimmer returned, duller now, but persistent. The black fur receded, and the man returned. He was gray-faced, his skin cold to the touch. Eliza didn't hesitate. She grabbed a large bore needle and performed a needle decompression on his chest to relieve the pressure of the internal bleeding. A hiss of air escaped, and Alexander's eyes snapped open, focusing on her. Eliza, he rasped, his hand finding hers, slick with his own blood. Don't talk. Just breathe, she commanded. She looked up. Silas had thrown Marcus aside and was stalking toward them, his silver blade raised high. His clothes were shredded, his chest heaving. He looked like the devil himself. Enough of this play acting, Silas screamed. The prophecy ends tonight. He swung the blade down. Eliza didn't flinch. She threw herself over Alexander, shielding his heart with her own. The blade stopped an inch from her throat. A hand, a human hand, but one as large and powerful as a mountain, had caught Silas's wrist. Alexander was standing. He wasn't fully healed, and he was covered in blood, but he was upright. The golden light radiating from him was no longer a shimmer. It was a blinding solar flare of power. It wasn't the power of a wolf. It was the power of a king who had finally accepted both sides of his soul. You speak of the prophecy, Silas, Alexander said, his voice dropping into a register that made the very stones of the courtyard vibrate. But you forgot the most important part. He twisted Silas's wrist. The sound of snapping bone echoed through the night. Silas screamed, dropping the silver blade. The Alpha of the North does not win through blood alone, Alexander said, his eyes burning like twin suns. He wins because he is the bridge. Alexander didn't kill him. He didn't tear out his throat. He simply placed a hand on Silas's chest and pushed. A wave of kinetic, golden energy erupted, sending the Southern Alpha flying across the courtyard, crashing into the stone fountain with enough force to shatter the marble. Silas lay still, his silver fur dull, his spirit broken. The remaining Southern wolves looked at their fallen leader, then at the man standing beside the human nurse. One by one, they lowered their heads. They didn't run. They submitted. The battle was over. Alexander swayed, the golden light fading. He turned to Eliza, his face a mask of exhaustion and love. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned his forehead against hers, their shared breath the only sound in the silent courtyard. "You came back," he whispered. "I'm a nurse, Alexander," she said, her hands finally starting to shake. "We never leave a patient behind." The morning after the battle did not smell of antiseptic or blood. It smelled of rain-washed pine and the heavy, sweet scent of damp earth. As the sun began to climb over the jagged peaks of the northern range, the Blackwell estate looked less like a battlefield and more like a cathedral of glass and stone. Eliza stood on the balcony of the master suite, wrapped in a robe of thick ivory silk. Her hands, usually raw from hospital soap and the grit of her old life, felt strange in their stillness. Below, in the courtyard where she had stood between two monsters just hours before, the 100 wolves were still there. But they were no longer a closing fist. They were a shield. They stood in disciplined ranks, their eyes fixed on the house. Some were northern warriors, their black and charcoal coats sleek in the morning light. Others were the remnants of the southern pack, those who had seen Silas's cruelty and chosen to bow to a king who valued life over purity. Together, they formed a living perimeter of fur and teeth, a testament to the bridge Eliza had built with nothing but a trauma kit and a mother's heart. A soft sound came from the doorway. Alexander stepped out, dressed in a simple black sweater. He moved with a slight stiffness, but the color had returned to his face. The wounds that would have killed a human and crippled a shifter were nearly gone, leaving behind only thin, silvery lines that he wore like medals of honor. "They're waiting for you," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that settled the fluttering in her chest. "For me?" Eliza turned, her brow furrowed. "I'm not the one who pushed an alpha into a fountain, Alexander." "No," he said, stepping closer until he was just inches away. The heat radiating from him was a constant, comforting presence now. "You're the one who stood in the path of a silver blade when everyone else was ready to let me die. You're the one who saved the son of an enemy. In our world, strength is common. But what you have, it's rare. It's the strength of a healer." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist. "The 100 wolves outside? They aren't here to guard a king. They are here to see the woman who proved that the old ways are dead. They are waiting for their queen." Eliza looked out at the silent, majestic animals. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, Alexander. I don't know how to be a queen. I only know how to be a nurse." "Then be a nurse," Alexander whispered, his eyes molten amber. "Heal my people. Heal our history. That is all I have ever wanted for the North." The transition from the margins to the center of the world happened with a quiet, deliberate grace. Alexander did not force her into a public coronation. He understood that her soul needed peace before it could handle power. Over the following week, Eliza's old life was gently folded away. Marcus, now her most devoted shadow, had personally visited Pinewood General. He didn't just resign on her behalf. He made a significant endowment to the hospital in her name, ensuring that the nurses who remained would never have to choose between a patient's hand and a disciplinary write-up again. Her small, rented cottage was bought and converted into a permanent sanctuary for the Shadow Pines, a place where the veil between worlds would always be thin, kept as a memorial to the night the wolf came to her door. But the most profound healing happened within the walls of the estate. In the nursery, Lucy and the little boy from the crate, whose name was Leo, became inseparable. The air in the Blackwell Manor, filtered by ancient magic and modern science, had done what a dozen specialists could not. Lucy hadn't touched her rescue inhaler in 7 days. She spent her afternoons running through the sprawling gardens, her laughter echoing through the pines, followed by a small, silt-colored wolf pup who seemed to think he was her personal guardian. Eliza spent her days in the medical wing, which was being expanded into a research center. She wasn't just stitching wounds anymore. She was working with shifter scholars to document their biology, finding ways to blend human medicine with their innate healing abilities. She was no longer just the healer of the North. She was the architect of a new era. One evening, as the first frost began to sparkle on the needles of the pines, Alexander found her in the library. He was holding a small, weathered book, one of the original scrolls of the prophecy. "There is one more part of the story," he said, sitting beside her on the velvet sofa. "The part I didn't tell you the night of the battle." Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, the smell of him, forest and ozone, filling her senses. "Tell me, the prophecy says that the Alpha and the Healer will not just rule together. It says they will find a peace that neither world could achieve alone. A reconciliation of the spirit." He looked at her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I've lived 300 years, Eliza. I've seen wars, I've seen the rise and fall of cities. But I have never felt at peace until I saw you standing in my kitchen with that skillet." Eliza laughed softly, the sound light and free. "It was a very good skillet, Alexander." "It was," he agreed, his eyes darkening with affection. "But it was the woman holding it that changed the world." He leaned down, his lips brushing hers. A kiss that tasted of a long, hard-won victory and the quiet promise of 1,000 tomorrows. Outside, the 100 wolves began to howl. It wasn't the chilling, predatory sound that had terrified her at the cottage. It was a symphony of belonging, a song that carried across the valleys and over the peaks, announcing to the hidden world that the war was over. The king was whole. The healer had found her home, and the shadow pines were finally silent, at rest in the arms of the moon. The first snow of the year fell with a gentleness that felt like an apology from the heavens. At the Blackwell estate, the jagged edges of the world had been softened by a layer of pristine white. Eliza sat in the sunroom, a cup of tea warming her palms, watching the landscape. The 100 wolves were still there, but they no longer stood in the rigid, terrifying ranks of war. Instead, they moved through the trees like silver spirits, their presence a silent, comforting heartbeat that surrounded the manor. In the center of the frosted garden, Lucy was building a snow fort. She was bundled in a bright red coat, her cheeks flushed with a health Eliza had once thought impossible. Beside her, Leo, the boy Eliza had pulled from the brink of death, was helping her pile the snow, his laughter ringing out clear and strong. There was no wheeze in Lucy's breath, no fear in her eyes. She wasn't a girl hiding from the world anymore. She was a child of the North, protected by a king and cherished by a pack. Alexander stepped into the room, his presence as steady as the earth. He didn't say a word as he sat beside Eliza, simply reaching out to lace his fingers with hers. The 100 wolves that had once surrounded her house as a threat were now the guardians of their shared future. The scars on his side had faded to faint memories, just as the financial pressures and the exhaustion of her old life had become ghosts of a different era. They looked out at the children, then at the wolves, and finally, at each other. The bridge between the human and the shifter, the nurse and the king, was no longer a fragile idea. It was a reality built on blood, iron, and a love that defied the laws of both worlds. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, a profound silence settled over the estate. It wasn't the silence of secrets kept, but the quiet, deep peace of a world finally beginning to heal. "Thank you for joining me for this journey into the heart of the Shadow Pines. If you were moved by Eliza's courage and the redemption of the Alpha King, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with fellow dreamers. Your engagement helps us bring more cinematic tales of romance, mystery, and the supernatural to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter in our world of legends. Until next time, remember, even in the darkest woods, healing is always possible. Thank you for watching.